Hi, this is Peter Schiff. Many Keynesian economists, most notably Nobel laureate Paul Krugman, have been criticizing Austrian economists like me for the predictions we made with respect to inflation. According to guys like Krugman, we said that all the money printing at the Federal Reserve, otherwise known as quantitative easing, would cause inflation. And the Keynesians now point to the CPI as proof that we were wrong, because the CPI has not shown a significant pickup in inflation. In fact, the CPI has been registering annualized inflation rates of between 2 to 3%, which, according to guys like Krugman, prove that we're wrong. Now, first of all, I never said that all the money printing would cause inflation. I said that the money printing was inflation, and that the inflation that the Fed creates as it prints money would result in rising prices. But Krugman again would say, but Peter Schiff is wrong because prices haven't risen. But again, the proof that he offers and that other Keynesians offer are government-created statistics that purport to measure inflation, like the CPI. The problem is the CPI is wrong. The CPI is doing a lousy job of measuring inflation, and in fact, I think it deliberately does so by design. Every time somebody alleges that the government's been cooking the books, all of a sudden, it's the conspiracy theory. How could the government be conspiring to fudge the numbers? It's not that they're fudging the numbers. It's just that the methodology for computing the CPI has been deliberately designed to hide the true effects inflation has on consumer prices. In fact, I'm not the only one that's convinced that inflation is a lot higher than the government admits. Fox News happened to do a presidential poll about a month before the election, and they polled over 1,000 registered voters. And by an overwhelming margin, in fact, by almost 2 to 1, the people who were polled identified rising prices or inflation as their primary economic concern. Almost twice as many people were worried about rising prices as were worried about unemployment. Well, if the government is correct, if the CPI is accurate, then why are so many people worried about inflation that doesn't exist? To me, it's more likely that the inflation does exist and that the CPI is wrong. After all, what makes more sense? That the government could print all this money and prices not rise, or that prices are rising and the government is just not being honest about it? I decided to run an experiment of my own to judge the accuracy of today's consumer price index. So what I did is I selected 20 consumer goods that people pretty much buy every week, and I wanted to compare the increase in the price of that basket during 2 time periods. During the decade of the 1970s, when everybody agrees there was a lot of inflation, and the most recent 10-year period ending December 2012. The items that I selected for my basket were eggs, new cars, milk, gasoline, bread, rent for a primary residence, coffee, dental services, potatoes, electricity, sugar, airline tickets, butter, store-purchased beer, apples, public transportation, cereal, tires, beef, and prescription drugs. Now, during the decade of the 1970s, the consumer price index rose by a whopping 112%. That was the official number. But take a look at our basket of 20 goods. That basket rose by almost an identical percentage, 117%. Our basket of goods only rose 5% faster than the overall CPI. In other words, the government's official report of inflation pretty much captured all the inflation that was evidenced by my basket. Now let's contrast that to the decade 2002 to 2012. During that 10-year period, the official CPI rose just 27.5%, much more slowly than it did during the inflationary decade of the 1970s. But take a look at our basket. Our basket of 20 goods during that same time period went up by 44.3%. In other words, the price of our goods in this basket rose 61% faster than the official CPI. Contrast that to the same basket of goods in the 1970s that only rose 5% faster. But it actually gets worse because the government numbers are wrong, and I'll prove that to you. For example, one of the categories in the CPI that's not in our basket is newspapers and magazines. Now, according to the government, from 1999 through the end of 2012, the price of newspapers and magazines increased by 37.1%. That's the number the government uses to calculate the official CPI numbers. Well, just for kicks, I wanted to see how accurate the government was. With newspapers and magazines, it's very easy to check prices. They're printed right on the covers. So I looked at the prices of America's 10 most popular newspapers and magazines. I wanted to see what the prices were in 1999 and compare them with the prices today. Now, the newspapers and magazines I used were the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, Time Magazine, Sports Illustrated, U.S. News and World Report, Newsweek, People, the New York Times, USA Today, and the Los Angeles Times. Now, the average increase in the cover price of those 10 newspapers and magazines during that same time period is 131.5%. 131.5 versus an official price increase of 37.1. In other words, the actual rate of increase in the price of newspapers and magazines is 3.5 times what the government claims it was. You know, it's interesting. You've got all these newspapers that are reporting on the fact that there's no inflation. Apparently, they haven't noticed what they're actually charging for those papers. But it's not just limited to newspapers and magazines. Take the case of health insurance. Health insurance is also a component of the official CPI. Now, according to the government, in the 5-year period from 2008 to 2012, health insurance prices increased by a mere 4.3%. That's it. 4.3% is the entire contribution to the CPI index from health insurance. I don't know where these government statisticians are buying their health insurance, but believe me, I wish I could find an insurance company who's only increased their premiums by 4.3% over the last 5 years. I mean, would we really have had Obamacare? Would the government have been able to sell us that bill of goods if insurance premiums were rising by such a low rate? I mean, that's actually lower than the official rate of inflation. Now, it's not just my own experience with health insurance that causes me to question these government numbers. According to a Kaiser survey of employer-sponsored health insurance, the actual increase in insurance premiums over that time period was 24.2%. So in other words, the actual increase in the price of health insurance was 5.5 times faster than the official price increase used by the government to calculate the CPI. Of course, even if the government had accurately represented the true increase in the cost of health insurance premiums in the CPI, it wouldn't have had that big an impact on the overall number because the government has a weighting of about 1% in the CPI to health insurance. This is despite the fact that according to that same Kaiser survey, the annual cost to the typical American family for health insurance exceeds $15,000 a year, which is almost 1/3 of median household income. So if the government is wrong about newspapers and magazines, if they're wrong about health insurance, why should we believe they're right about anything? Who knows what these numbers are, where the government comes up with these numbers? But we know this, the last thing the government wants is for the public and for investors to know how much inflation we have. So there clearly is a vested interest on the part of the government to fool the world into believing that there's no inflation. After all, if they admitted there was inflation, they couldn't keep stimulating the economy and claiming that all the quantitative easing wasn't causing inflation. The government would be forced to deal with a deficit if they acknowledged that there was inflation. And of course, nobody in Congress wants to vote to cut Social Security benefits or cut Medicare benefits, but by creating inflation and lying about it, that's exactly what they're doing. Because Social Security COLAs tied to the CPI aren't going up fast enough to keep pace with the real rate of inflation. And of course, what do these clowns in Washington want to do? They're actually claiming that the CPI is overstating inflation. They want to go to something called the chain-weighted CPI, which in reality will understate it even more. If the CPI were accurate, it would reveal an annual rate of inflation that is probably very close to the types of inflation that we experienced during the 1970s. It's my opinion that the true rate of inflation is probably somewhere between 7 and 10%. That is inflation as measured by an increase in consumer prices. But the real bad news is the real rate of inflation would be much higher than that if it wasn't for other mitigating factors, in particular, America's enormous trade deficits and the willingness of our trading partners to absorb those dollars, to accumulate enormous dollar reserves and invest them in U.S. treasuries. Even though the Fed is creating all this money, foreigners are supplying us with all the merchandise that we don't manufacture, and we don't have to export anything to import it. We just export all those surplus dollars, and we get all these products. So money flows out, and goods flow in. That keeps a lid on domestic prices. They're still rising despite that, but not nearly as much as they would if we didn't have those trade deficits being recycled by foreign governments. And what are those foreign governments doing with all the dollars that they're accumulating? They're buying U.S. treasuries. So you can see the inflation in the bond market. We have a bond bubble because of those recycled surpluses. We are exporting our inflation. But what happens when the process reverses? What happens when foreign central banks no longer want to hoard all those dollars? They're going to want to spend them. They're going to want to cash in their bonds, and they're going to want to use those dollars to buy actual things. Then the process reverses. That's when a tidal wave of dollars is going to wash up on our shore, and Americans are going to drown in the sea of inflation. Because then it's not money going out and goods coming in. It's goods going out and money going in. And Americans are going to have to compete with foreigners for all the things they want to buy. Foreigners are going to be bidding up the prices of everything that's not nailed down, and even some things that are. And also think about this. The economy is weak. Why aren't prices falling? Think about the Great Depression. Consumer prices were down by about 30%. They're not down at all during this Great Recession. They're still rising. The government claims they're not rising that fast, but the fact that they're rising at all is problematic. It's better if the cost of living goes down, not if the cost of living goes up. But the fact of the matter is the cost of living is going up much faster than the government admits, and eventually that's going to come back to bite us. Of course, by then, it's much too late for the Fed to do something about it. There's an old expression, once the inflation genie is out of the bottle, it's nearly impossible to put her back in. This is the problem that the Fed is going to be confronted with, or more precisely, the problem that we're going to have to deal with, because the Fed waited too long, created so much inflation, but claimed there wasn't any, because they were relying on a busted barometer called the CPI. So don't forget, share this video with your friends. Anybody who believes government propaganda that there is no inflation needs to watch this video. We need to dispel this myth once and for all. The public needs to understand the inflation that the government is creating. And if you want to know the rest of the story, if you want to know the truth behind the headlines, if you want to know all the ways the government continues to pull the wool over your eyes, make sure and tune into my daily radio show, The Peter Schiff Show. I do it Monday through Friday, 10 a.m. to noon Eastern at schiffradio.com. Bye for now.